Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time we're going to look at 5 64-bit operating systems for the Raspberry Pi 4. Whilst the Raspberry Pi 4 has a 64-bit processor, at the time of making this video, the standard version of Raspberry Pi OS remains 32-bit for backwards compatibility. However, a 64-bit operating system and applications can directly access more memory and process more data per instruction cycle. Indeed, in a recent video, I applied a filter in GIMP on a Raspberry Pi 4 running 32-bit Raspberry Pi OS and 64-bit Ubuntu 20.04. And as we can see, the filter was applied more than twice as quickly on the 64-bit system. Now, admittedly, an image processing test like this may be a special case. Even so, if you've got a Raspberry Pi 4 with a 4GB or 8GB of RAM in particular, you should get a significant performance improvement running a 64-bit operating system and applications. And so, in that context, let's go and take a closer look at Manjaro, Ubuntu MATE, Ubuntu, Gentoo, and OpenSUSE. Right, here we are on the website for Manjaro, which provides an excellent 64-bit operating system for the Raspberry Pi 4 that's very easy to install. And if we look under editions here and we look under ARM and Raspberry Pi 4, you'll see there's 2 editions of Manjaro 20.06 available for the Raspberry Pi 4. One with a KDE Plasma desktop and one with an XFCE desktop. Now, XFCE is less resource hungry and its interface will therefore run a little faster on the Raspberry Pi 4. But as KDE Plasma looks so amazing, it's a beautiful interface, that's the one we're going to be running here. And all we need to do is to download an image, which we can then write to a microSD card using a program such as the Etcher. Now, in this video, I'm going to be running all of the operating systems on my ultimate Raspberry Pi 4 rig that I built a few videos back. This features an 8GB Raspberry Pi 4 with an Ice Tower cooler, and it's connected to an M.2 SATA drive via a USB adapter. However, for our tests here, I'm going to be running all of the operating systems from a 32GB SanDisk Extreme Pro microSD card. So, if we turn on the power, and the Pi 4 will come to life and boot into Manjaro. And if we speed on through, we soon get to the login screen where I can enter my password. And here we are, arriving on the Manjaro desktop. And I should just say this is not my first boot. As usual, I have been in just to change scaling factors and things to record things better on video. And I should point out that on the first boot, you will see a screen like this where you have to do various setup. You have to set your keyboard layout, which for me was a UK. You then have to set up a username. I used EC. Additional groups, I pressed enter to ignore that. Full name for EC, I put EC again, and that to enter my password. It then asks for a root password. You don't have to set that, but I did. You then need to enter a time zone, which for me was Europe and London, which was down there, and then a locale, which for me was English GB, and then a host name for the system, which I made Pi 4. And with that all correct, I could click on yes to finish setting up Manjaro. If we go back to the desktop, here we are. Let's look into the menu, see what we have here pre-installed. Various things under graphics. Actually, not a lot under graphics, is there? But internet, we've got Firefox there. We've got LibreOffice, as you would expect. And if we go down to settings, which is the exciting thing in the KDE and system settings, this is very exciting. Oh, look, a bouncing cursor there. And this is pretty good. We've got transparency going on there. This is not bad on a Raspberry Pi in terms of responsiveness, even with a fairly heavy desktop like this. And in KDE, you can play with all sorts of things, set the different themes, set what it calls the plasma style. This isn't running too badly, a little bit of a lag there, but really this is pretty good on a Raspberry Pi. And let's just launch the Firefox browser. Let's go on to the web. Oh, we've got a bouncy Firefox thing there. That's rather nice, isn't it? And if we go to a test YouTube clip, I should point out that everything here is running as you see it out of the box. I'm sure you could do lots of things to try and optimize video playback. I've not done any of those things, which I think is the fairest way to test everything out. And this is running not too badly, a little bit of lag there. It's not perfect. We've still got this issue of having hardware GPU support in well, all operating systems on single board computers, but certainly with 64-bit ones on the Raspberry Pi. This is not brilliant YouTube playback, is it? Let's be honest, this is not perfect out of the box, but it's running okay. But I think really if you're going to run something like KDE in Manjaro, you're doing it to have something which looks graphically lovely rather than anything else. Anyway, this is Manjaro, a nice 64-bit operating system, but let's now move on to look at another distro. Greetings! Here I am back again to take a look at Ubuntu MATE 20.04 running on the Raspberry Pi 4. And if we look here in the download section of the website, you'll see it's available for standard PCs, but it's also available for the Raspberry Pi, either 32-bit or a 64-bit versions. And of course here I've gone for a 64-bit because that's the whole purpose of this video, and I've downloaded and installed a Focal Fossa 20.04 Ubuntu MATE, which is very new at the time of making this video, very exciting. And you just again have to download an image. I took the image from a direct download there. You just have to download the image and write it to a micro SD card. And again, as we saw with the Manjaro, there is a bit of setup to do during the install process, but here it's all done graphically as during the first boot, a very friendly setup wizard comes up, which you use to enter your language, your keyboard layout, and your geographic location before creating a user account. And when that's all taken place, you can boot up Ubuntu MATE and you'll end up with a desktop looking like this, which is rather nice. And as you can see, you get a welcome screen, and the nice thing is here on the welcome screen there's even some Raspberry Pi information, which is really good to see. And it mainly reminds us we're working here on an ARM-based system, not an x86-based system, and so certain applications will not be compatible. They won't be compiled for an ARM-based system like a Raspberry Pi. Anyway, let's close that down, take a look at the menu, which is incredibly responsive, really nice system to use this. Quite a reasonable amount of things installed, accessories, administration, no educational things, sorry about that. Graphical stuff, we've got Firefox there on the internet, LibreOffice is there, what a surprise, preferences, etc. This is cool. But let's run up the Firefox browser again and do a YouTube test. Oh look, the world's favourite website works under Ubuntu MATE 64-bit on the Raspberry Pi 4. But we will go to YouTube. I've got my sample clip over there, and it'll hopefully come up in a second, and we'll full screen it like that, and hopefully it'll play. Is it going to come up? Just having a little buffer, there it is, and I'll just bring up Stats for Nerds down there, and I've been testing this out, and my experience of this is it takes a while to settle, but once it's settled, playback is very good indeed, and I think we'll see that on the drop frames at the top. They aren't going to move on very much now the thing has settled down. This is very good playback of a 1080p video on a Raspberry Pi 4. I'm impressed with this. This is a lot better than we saw under the KDE Plasma under Manjaro. This is a pretty good YouTube playback on a Raspberry Pi 4, which is great to see. I've tried watching several YouTube videos on this system and they work very well indeed. A little bit of tearing happening around there I think, but other than that, this is a very nice system. So I'm impressed with this. I think Ubuntu MATE, I've always liked it as an operating system anyway. I always associate it with the Odroid XU4 for some reason, but it seems to work very nice in its 64-bit version on the Raspberry Pi 4. Right, staying with Ubuntu, next we're going to try the standard Ubuntu 20.04 desktop. This can be installed in various ways, but here I'm starting from the raspberrypi.org website, where we'll go to Downloads, and if we scroll down we will find third-party operating system images, and we can go to Ubuntu Server. And if we scroll down here, you'll see there's various versions available, including a 64-bit version for the Raspberry Pi 4, which is the file we're going to download. This file then needs writing to a microSD card in the normal fashion, and then we can boot from the card, which will get us to a terminal interface, as you can see here. We now need to log in using the username Ubuntu, like that. Password is also Ubuntu, which of course we're asked to change. Next, I'm going to use a very handy script from Martin Wimpress to convert this server version of Ubuntu 20.04 into a desktop version. The script is called desktopify and is available via GitHub. To use it, all we need to do is to clone the git with this command. And with that complete, we can just change to the desktopify directory and install the desktop like this. And there we are. It's now going to get on with the process of installing the desktop and this copy of Ubuntu 20.04. And there we are, it's finished. So we just now do a sudo reboot. We should boot into Ubuntu 20.04 desktop edition. And there we are. We can now log in. And we're now running Ubuntu 20.04 desktop on the Raspberry Pi 4. I'm going to skip creating online accounts. I'll get rid of that as well. I'll send information to Canonical, that's fine. This is a standard Ubuntu first boot setup. That is fine too. And there we are, we're ready to go. And this is standard Ubuntu 20.04 running on our Raspberry Pi 4. I still think this is really cool. When looking down in the applications there, you'll see lots of things are pre-installed for us in a standard Ubuntu kind of way. We've got the Firefox web browser, so let's launch that, see how that works. There we are, that's coming up. And by the magic of filmmaking, I've got my sample YouTube video sitting there. See how this works on this system. And there we are. Hopefully it's going to buffer and come up in a second. And just bring up Stats for Nerds. There we go. And oh, that seems to be doing okay. This isn't playing too badly, is it? This is pretty good. There's a few drop frames, not a lot. I think this is certainly as good as we saw in the previous distro we were looking at. And yeah, this is pretty good. So once again, we've got decent YouTube playback in a 64-bit operating system on the Raspberry Pi 4. Yes, this is actually, that's pretty good. The tearing there was almost non-existent. That's rather good indeed. I've gone and crushed it by moving the mouse, haven't I? But never mind, that was working rather well. So there we are. Another option for us in terms of 64-bit systems on a Raspberry Pi is Ubuntu 20.04. Greetings. Here I am back again, now running Gentoo on the Raspberry Pi 64-bit, otherwise known as a GenPi64. And this is a distro which has been put together and which is maintained here on GitHub by a unscarier Gentoo girl. And she's done a really good job of this distro. It's very straightforward to install, by far the most straightforward install of the operating systems I've looked at so far in this video. All you need to do is to go down to the download links, which are here, and you can download either the full version, which includes the desktop, which I'm running here, or a light version without a desktop. And you simply write that file to a microSD card in the standard way, everything boots up, that's all there is to it. And if we take a look at the desktop, you'll see here it is, rather nice. And I should point out that whilst you don't have to configure things to get this running, there's a very nice screen comes up when you do first boot if you want to change things like your HDMI settings, things like that. Although personally I found everything worked absolutely fine on the first boot. We get loads of applications pre-installed here. To go up here to have a look at that. You'll notice, by the way, this is an XFCE desktop. If you're thinking what one of those, it is. And in terms of all the installed things, we've got lots of accessories here, development tools, LibreOffice Math under Education, graphics tools, including GIMP is sitting there, lots and lots of internet applications, multiple browsers there. great things under multimedia, including the Raspberry Pi Camera Live View app there. That's a nice thing to see, isn't it? It shows that an unscary Gentoo girl is really thinking about what people will want and will need to use on a Raspberry Pi. We've also got loads of Office apps, both Abbey Word and the LibreOffice Suite, and one other thing there, and various system apps. So if you want to have a distro where you basically download one file, write it to your card, boot it up, everything's pre-installed for you for lots of use, then this is a very good distro to go for. I will just try out YouTube playback again. And if you're wondering, why do I keep trying out YouTube playback? It's because the Raspberry Pi 4 is marketed as a board which can be used as a small desktop PC. And the only thing it really struggles at, in my view, in that respect, is playing back a video in a browser, which is why I keep testing it out. And of course, I'm a YouTuber, so of course I'm interested in YouTube playback anyway. So let's bring up our standard clip. I'm not sure there's going to be fantastic hardware support here for playback here, but we'll see what's going to happen. Hopefully it's going to get to that full screen. Go on, go full screen, you swine. There we are. Have to tell these computers sternly occasionally, don't you? It'll get there for us. It's having a think. There it is. And I'll just bring up Stats for Nerds, hopefully. Where's Stats for Nerds gone? Stats for Nerds is hiding. Come on. It's not giving it to me, dearie me. There we are. It was hiding there. We found it. And let's see how it's going to do. It's not spectacular so far. It perhaps isn't fair to expect a distro like this to actually have everything. Let's go back to the start and have another go of playing things through. This is not as good as we've seen in, for example, Ubuntu 20.04 or in Ubuntu MATE. So this distro, great distro, but maybe not the one to pick if you want to play a video perhaps on the Raspberry Pi 4 in a browser. But other than that, I really like, as you can tell, Gentoo on the Raspberry Pi 4 64-bit, a very nice distro to experiment with. Right, our final operating system is OpenSUSE, which is a distro I've never looked at before and which we're now booting on the Raspberry Pi 4. It's worth pointing out that the boot process takes well over 3 minutes as the system appears to load a RAM disk, and so here I will clearly speed on till we get to the login screen. Here by default we log in as a root with the password Linux like that, and hopefully in a second we'll arrive on the OpenSUSE desktop. And here we are. And you do always at the moment get this error, but you can just close it down. And it's also worth noting that right now there is no audio output from either HDMI or the 3.5mm jack. Installation is nice and straightforward. If I just open up the web page where I got this image from, it'll open up in a second. There we are, opening up in Firefox. That's pretty fast actually, going through into that. And here you will see there are two possible things you can download. You can either get the tumbleweed version, which is a rolling version, or you can get the stable version, which is called Leap. And there's lots of different desktops you can choose with these as well. As you can see here, loads and loads and loads of options. I've actually taken the E20 Enlightenment option. I've downloaded therefore that image here. And all you need to do is to download the image, write it to a microSD card and boot up. And you will on first boot be taken through a very cool graphical wizard, which includes a really great option for setting your preferred text size. That's a really nice feature to see. If we take a look at the desktop, it is great. I love the look and feel here. This is a beautiful distro. I should have looked at this before. People have been telling me to look at OpenSUSE for a long while. I can see why. It's really, really nice. I love the terminal, which is called Terminology. Some great graphical effects here running very nicely. For the Pi here we've got a temperature gauge, we've got a processor speed gauge as well if we want it. We've got down here the menu which has got quite a few things pre-installed. Again, just a nice feel to this. This is a really nice operating system just to work with. Sometimes you come across a distro and go, that's just nice, and this is just nice. Now, I will do the YouTube test because I've been doing it for the other distros, but of course you wouldn't choose to watch YouTube videos on a system without audio, but let's just bring up the sample clip. And there we are, we're now running with Stats for Nerds, and our silent playback is pretty good actually. It's had quite a few drop frames initially, but once it's settled it seems to be running okay. So this would be a great distro right now for watching silent movies in, all those HD videos of a Charlie Chaplin if they happen to exist. Anyway, here we are, OpenSUSE. This is a distro that people have been asking me to look at on my channel for a very long time, and I think having seen it running here on the Raspberry Pi 4, I'll definitely return to it to do a full review of it running on an x86 PC. So there we are, 5 64-bit operating systems for the Raspberry Pi 4. And there are others, including the 64-bit version of Raspberry Pi OS, which I'll review in detail on this channel when it comes out of beta. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.